All right. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be here today. When I received an email asking me to speak for 90 minutes to a captive audience about anything that I wanted to, that's about all I can ask for in life, really. So today, the Catholic imagination, how that relates, and I had to use that phrase social justice at the end just because in this day and age, it's one of those phrases that gets so much attention. Whether it causes you to prostrate before the altar of the unknown God, or whether it makes your skin crawl and your blood boil, it's something that gets attention. Um, and what's at its core is something that's very important. And the way that we approach it, I think, is the most important thing. And with my background, I have a PhD in comparative literature. I did my dissertation on Dante and one of his contemporary critics. My world is that of historical Catholic culture. So when I speak of the Catholic imagination, above all, what I'm talking about today is the practical utility of this fantastic 2,000-year patrimony that we have that at one point in time was seen as essential, not even essential, but simply synonymous with Western civilization. So I think to illustrate sort of what I'm getting at here, we'll begin with a story that comes from Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio is an Italian writer from Florence who lives in the generation after Dante. We know him best because he's responsible for giving us the best account there is of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, how it moved through Florence, what it did to both the individual human body, but above all, what it did to the body politic, the city of Florence, the way that it absolutely fractured social ties there. His work, the Decameron, is written right in the aftermath of the Black Death. And it's very much about how humankind pieces itself back together. How do you have society after you've watched half of the population die over a period of 6 months? Sadly, trying to deal with that kind of tragedy is something that's not unique to Boccaccio's place in time. And as Catholics, it's something that the church has responded to repeatedly throughout its history. So I'm going to bring up the second story that occurs in the Decameron, which is a collection. It's Boccaccio basically inventing the short story as significant literature rather than just cute little tales. And in the second story that he tells, Boccaccio is speaking about a merchant who lived in Paris and had significant dealings with a Jew named Abraham. And as their business dealings continue over the years, the merchant of Paris recognizes in Abraham a fantastically good human being. And this recognition is fantastic, but it's also melancholy because he fears for Abraham's damnation. So bit by bit, he very slowly starts working on Abraham to try to get him to convert to the Christian faith. And Abraham is very much loyal to his Jewish faith. Finally, it reaches a point where Abraham recognizes that the merchant of Paris is not going to stop. So there has to be some sort of resolution to this. And Abraham explains, I have to go to visit some of my relations in Rome. I have to conduct some business there, and while I'm there, I'm going to take time to really examine your faith. I hear that your Pope is the head of your church, and his curia, who runs the church for him, they're all in Rome. So I'll have the opportunity to really examine the faith and see what it's all about. The merchant of Paris is horrified by this idea because he's afraid that if this Jew goes to Rome and sees the papal curia and the way that the papal curia was living in the 13th century, that there would be no hope of ever transforming him into being Catholic. Simply because of the corruption in Rome at the time, he figures if he goes that there's no chance of converting him. But at this point in time, there's nothing he can do. So he says, all right, God be with you, and come see me when you come back. A couple months pass, and then Abraham returns, and he goes to the house of the merchant, and he explains that he had a good business deal. They settle all of their business concerns. And then the merchant slowly, regretfully brings up the question, so what did you actually see in Rome? And Abraham says, I saw one of the most disgusting displays of my life. I saw the curia completely enmeshed in avarice. I saw them engaged in nothing but making as much money off as they could off of every tourist, off of everybody who was there to litigate a case before the Pope. And this really got me thinking. And the merchant says, well, that's about what I expected. There's no chance of him converting now. And Abraham says, and when I saw this, I decided at that moment I have to become Catholic and I would like you to baptize me. And the merchant is horrified and he says, I'm certainly happy to do so, but I have to ask, how did you come to this conclusion? And Abraham says, I went to Rome and I saw my community completely oppressed, put into its own ghetto, forced to wear clothing, despite no matter how loyal we are to our God, this is our condition. And while I'm in the same city, I saw the behavior of the curia. I saw the behavior of the people who claim to be leading your church. And yet I see your church flourishing. So based on the fact that your church is flourishing and your leaders are so incredibly corrupt, this can only be a sign that yours is the correct religion and that you have God's faith. If we know anything about the medieval curia, we can recognize sort of the joke here. This is a story that has been completely misunderstood by most modern readers of Boccaccio. They want to see in this story an idea that the church has always been corrupt, always will be corrupt, and that the conversion that we have here is just Boccaccio telling a little joke. That's how we read the story if we look at it with a modern understanding, separating daily lived experience from that of the church. If we think of the church as something that we go to on Sunday and then we conduct our affairs, that's absolutely how the story would be read. Boccaccio's point is completely different, though. Boccaccio's point is that the role of the merchant is not just one who conducts business, but it's one who has concern for the people around him. The real point of this story is the concern that the merchant has for his friend, that he's concerned he's facing damnation, and he does everything possible to try to bring this person, not just to good business dealings with him, but to salvation. It's the love that the merchant has of Abraham that's the real point of the story. And then, of course, Boccaccio being somewhat anti-clerical, and if you lived in Italy in the 14th century, it would be very hard not to be at least somewhat anti-clerical. As Boccaccio is writing these stories, the papacy, of course, is in Avignon, and Rome is so thoroughly corrupted and violent, it's simply not safe for the popes to return until the Roman families can sort of be put in line. The Catholic imagination that sees all of human experience as united makes this story not just a one-note joke about church leadership. It makes it a beautiful story about the concern of one man for another that he ordinarily would have nothing to do with. And it also shows God working through very imperfect people. And this is Boccaccio's work, of course, is how can we find God after the plague? How can we bring civilization back? And it's being brought back here through what I'm describing as the Catholic imagination. I got that phrase out of a discussion with Cardinal Stafford over the summer. We were discussing some research that I'm doing for the Archdiocese, and he used that phrase as a description of what so much of the church lacks today, is that there's viewpoints, there's beliefs, but an imagination that's encompassing is utterly lacking. This conversation occurred at the height of the protests in June, which is where the second part of today's lecture comes from. What you saw were people in the streets, many of whom motivated by the highest desires to push for a greater unity of humankind. However, this zeal turns into violence against property, violence against ideas. As people were tearing down statues, a statue is nothing more than an ideal encased in concrete reality and turned into public property. What I noticed about these events was the desire for improving the human condition was completely detached from any coherent worldview that would allow for real unity. To put this most succinctly, in the words of secular humanists themselves, all love begins with the love of self. The worst thing that we can do for African Americans at this point in time would be to make white people hate themselves. Even within the worldview of secular humanism, so much of what was occurring this summer could not possibly work because it wasn't grounded in a coherent worldview that allows us to come together. And that's sort of the reality of secular humanism. It's a term that's thrown around very frequently, and it's embraced by people who perhaps don't fully understand what it means. For my background, I'm sort of in a unique position to straddle the line between secular humanism and the Catholic worldview. I did my PhD studies at Columbia University. And Columbia University in New York is, it's basically ground zero for what Bill O'Reilly would be talking about in the mid-2000s with the culture wars. When I was at Columbia, you could always spot a slow news day on Fox News because the Fox News van would pull up to Columbia, send a reporter out with a cameraman and a phone, and just find any random Columbia student to interview. And inevitably, any conversation with a Columbia student on that day would turn into something entertaining that they could then put on one of their shows later that night. Secular humanism, as articulated by academia, when they try to turn it into a coherent worldview, turns into something that cannot possibly create a better united world for very specific reasons of what it posits to be true. When it looks at the human being, it accepts dualism at best, a total separation or almost complete separation between mind and body, the belief that the mind is completely separate, that the body is just a physical carrier for it. That's the best view of the human being according to secular humanism. The more scientific view, which is very rarely stated out loud because people tend to just reject it completely, horrified by its implications, is what's known as epiphenomenalism, where the idea that our consciousness is simply an evolutionary byproduct, that it's something that was not supposed to happen. What we would consider to be decisions are all really just the interactions of neurons firing according to material law, and that consciousness is an unintentional byproduct of this. We don't actually control decisions, but our consciousness allows us to perceive as though that's true. This is the basic view of humanity in secular humanism. The idea that we are now seeing expressed in the, I mean, not just ethically horrific, but scientifically absurd discussion between in the trans idea that gender is something, I'm sorry, that not just gender, but sex itself is not biologically determined, that sex itself is socially constructed. Comes out of this idea of what's, the blank slate, that when we are born, our minds are completely blank and they have to be filled in, the tabula rasa of ancient and Enlightenment philosophy, which leads to social constructivism, that if you take somebody and you put them in the correct environmental situation, you can teach them anything and you can make them anything. The idea of the trans argument that your personal identity can be completely detached from your biological reality only makes sense if you accept this idea. The blank slate makes no sense whatsoever, because if we are born as truly blank slates, all individuality is gone. If there's nothing that is essentially you other than your upbringing, there is nothing that is essentially you. You are just a reflection of what you have been around. On a simple psychological, neurological level, it makes no sense either, because if we are truly blank slates, learning anything is impossible. A blank slate does nothing. I'm bringing up these 2 points just to get to the larger point of what you see in so much of the unrest today cannot be directed towards anything that is ultimately productive of a better society. Because any view that you take from secular humanism, expressed in its usual atheistic form, if there is no creator that makes all of us, human rights are not self-evident truths. Human rights are something simply granted by a state when and where as convenient. And so if you take that concept to its logical conclusion, any group working for greater justice for any other group with this belief that human rights are granted by a state, you're not looking for real equality. You're just looking to prop up one group when it is convenient. And the moment that it ceases to be convenient, that group will lose its support. And as you see the tragic comical infighting in the progressive left over these ideas, you will see this again and again, that one group that had been supported as on the right side suddenly loses its status to another group that's viewed to be greater victims. For us in the church, the major problem that this creates is that most Catholics that I have encountered have unwillingly accepted this secular humanist worldview of reality as sort of their base operating view of the world, their worldview itself. And Catholic truth is somehow tried to be wedged into that somehow. We have a profound problem of not regularly integrating knowledge with wisdom. We don't always see, sometimes we don't even attempt to see how science illuminates rather than threatens Catholic truth. One response to having secular humanism on one hand and religion on the other is to go with what fundamentalist Christianity does in this country, and you create things like the Creation Museum, where you see people riding dinosaurs to prove a point about the literal truth of Genesis. I don't think that's a long-term solution for the health of Christianity. The other solution, and the one that I'm proposing with this concept of the Catholic integration, is to actively integrate our daily experiences with our beliefs, our daily experiences as we relate to the world in its historical and scientific sense. If we don't do this, one of our ideas will fail when they're in conflict. And I think we know which set of ideas, either this humanism or Catholic truth, we know which one of those is going to fail for most people when they're put into conflict. And this isn't a new idea. If there's any line that I truly, truly love out of Ecclesiastes, it is, there is nothing new under the sun. You can look at something and say this is new, but it has already been in days of old. This idea right here about having a divided secular and religious worldview. T.S. Eliot, the greatest poet of the 20th century, deals with this explicitly at the end of Murder in the Cathedral. Murder in the Cathedral, that brilliant play about the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. Many people are familiar with the first two acts as the tragedy unfolds. But a lot of people are turned off by the ending of Murder in the Cathedral, where we break down the supposed distance between the audience and the drama, and the characters who played the knights that execute Thomas Becket at the altar step forward and they address the audience specifically, and they give justifications for their act. And one of them says something that is so incredibly profound. The argument is something along the lines of, you think that we're bad because we killed the archbishop, and your natural tendency is with the underdog, who's the archbishop. We approve of that. But keep in mind, through our acts, we created a secular world. We created a secular government. We created the world that you live in and approve of. And that reflection on the reality that most people live in, it was as true for T.S. Eliot 80 years ago as it is for us today. That the separation of secular and religious spheres is a world that has been created, but that most people approve of in their daily interactions. The idea of imagination itself, even this is one that's thoroughly debased in the modern world. Imagination is seen as something that's appropriate for children, and it's quite often something that parents talk about. Usually, a discussion about the child's imagination comes before the line of, so don't tell my child what to do, which ultimately turns down to, don't tell me what to do. This concept of imagination, that it's a child's plaything, is fundamentally disjunctive. It separates out our mental experience from our experience with reality itself and the concrete reality we encounter every day. Imagination here is used as something that basically isolates and protects us from a reality that we don't particularly enjoy. The reality that's posited by secular humanism is not a positive, enjoyable one. Imagination is, to recast Marx's phrase, the opium of the secular humanist. If we look at the medieval concept of imagination, and here we'll look at Aquinas. When Aquinas talks about the vis imaginativa and imaginatio, he's talking about something far, far richer. He means the storehouse of sense impressions that are recorded and manipulated and can produce understanding and solutions. The visual imagination, the visual image itself is what we usually think of, but all sensory data for Aquinas, and this is part of what's known as medieval faculty psychology, that our soul is divided up into various faculties. And the way that we come to knowledge is that our senses present us with data from the outside world. That data is passed on in our mind, and it's presented to a particular faculty that is able to take these ideas, turn them into images, and combine them in new ways. It's not about escaping reality by creation of an unreality. It's about further understanding reality by taking these images of the perceptible world and coming to know something about the deeper reality that we cannot perceive with our senses. In the modern world, we limit imagination to unreality. And when we don't give it only over to children, the highest mode of imagination for us today is that of the billionaire entrepreneur. But even when we speak of those entrepreneurs as having imagination, we basically talk about them finding a way of making their own private unrealities turned into reality itself, realization. For the medieval thinking, however, imagination operates primarily on what is present in concrete, but also with spiritual reality. What I intend to show today is how Dante uses imagination in this strong sense to demonstrate the unity of God's work. What I intend to suggest is that a return to our Catholic cultural heritage, 2,000 years of Western civilization itself, provides a grounding for viewing reality through this lens of unity. Not science or faith, not history or faith, but science and history demonstrating faith. So what I'd like to do now, looking at the time and making sure I don't end up going over only 15 minutes in. I'm going to share my screen that has some slides. I'm looking at particular episodes from the Divine Comedy, where I'm showing what Dante does is use imagination in this strong, profound sense to demonstrate the unity of history and Christianity. History here in the sense of classical history, that classical world that Dante knew and loved. He wants to show how that's not separate from the Christian experience, but actually fundamentally tied into it. Because for Dante, all history is salvation history. So let's go ahead and hopefully that is visible now.
Yes.
So we're going to start off by skipping ahead. The bit of Dante that everybody's familiar with, of course, is Inferno, which the unfortunate reality for that is that that's what's always taught when we look at Dante in schools. And that's the part that's always taught because it's the easiest. Purgatory and Paradiso are so much richer, so much more interesting. As Dante goes through Purgatory, he envisions it as a mountain, an island mountain in the southern hemisphere. And at the very top of the island of Purgatory is the Garden of Eden, the original intended place for man that man loses. To reascend to the Garden of Eden, man goes up the terraces of purgatory. It's a mountain with ledges cut into the wall around it, and there's a ledge for each of the 7 deadly sins. And as the sinners go through purgatory, they take a turn on each ledge, correcting their souls, essentially, learning how to reorder their desires so that they can love God wholly. The first ledge that he goes up is the terrace of pride. And what we have here, the opening lines here, when we had passed through the threshold of the gate, which dishabituates the evil love of souls that make the crooked road seem like straight. And this is what purgatory is for Dante. It's not just about doing some penalty for our sins. It's about correcting our soul and removing that inclination to sin. And that inclination to sin, when acted upon, becomes habit. Habit is one of those fantastic words in medieval theology, habitus. As a real nerd, one of my favorite books is the Lexicon of Thomas Aquinas, which is a dictionary just of words that Aquinas uses. And it's probably a good 4 inches thick in, good quarto size. And the entry for habit, habitus, is, I believe, 4 pages long. It goes from everything, the gown that the monk wears, to the way that you go through life because of the way that you have ordered your actions on a daily basis. So purgatory here is all about changing those habits through the very slow process of allowing the soul to untwist itself and find the straight road to God again. As Dante and his guide, the Roman poet Virgil, and the Roman poet Virgil being Dante's guide is important as well because it's central to how Dante shows the unity between classical history and Christianity. As they're walking through, they come up on this first terrace, and they have to climb up a ladder to get there. And as they climb up onto this ladder, he can look out then and see here, get a little light up pointer in verse 22. From the plain's edge, verging on empty space, to where the cliff face soars again, was room for 3 men's bodies laid out end to end. As far as I could take in with my eyes, measuring carefully from left to right, this terrace did not vary in its width. And standing there, before we took a step, I realized that all the inner cliff, which rising sheer offered no means to climb, was pure white marble. On its flawless face were carvings that would surely put to shame not only Polyclitus, but nature too. So Dante and Virgil are on this mountain that appears to be a natural formation, but we get these immediate suggestions that it's not, that this ledge that's on the mountain is perfectly 18 feet wide all the way around. The inside of this ledge, which is the cliff face, the face that goes up the rest of the mountain, is inscribed with these deep relief carvings. And the carvings that he sees, he compares to human art to make the point that this goes far beyond the art of Polyclitus. Polyclitus was the greatest of all Greek sculptors, who was thought to put the human form into marble better than anybody. His Doryphorus is still one of the best known pieces of Western art. Not only is Polyclitus put to shame by what is on this mountain, but nature herself is too. And if we remember that beautiful metaphor that art is man imitating God through the act of creation. Nature is an intermediary in this because in Dante's world, nature's job is to put God's ideas into material reality. All of that kind of creation, both of man and nature, is put to shame by what Dante sees. Because what Dante sees are sculptures that are put into the rock by God himself. So imagination at its best, Dante is going to give us a description of this visual reality that is directly created by God. And within this visual reality, we're going to have this beautiful unification of cultures to learn the essential message of God does not differ through time and place. So they see 3 different images. The first, the angel who came down to announce on earth the peace longed for by weeping centuries, which broke the ancient ban and opened heaven, appeared before our eyes. So he sees the Annunciation. And if you're familiar with Dante at all, Dante is so deeply tied to Marian devotion, but also a meditation on the Annunciation and the Incarnation. Because the Incarnation, of course, is the ultimate unity of spiritual and material realities, where God and creation become one. A shape alive, carved in an attitude of marble grace, an effigy that could have spoken words. One would have sworn that he was saying Ave, for she who turned the key, opening for us the highest love, was also figured there. The outlines of her image carved the words Ecce ancilla Dei, behold the handmaiden of the Lord, as clearly cut as is the imprint of wax, of a seal on wax. And so Dante begins with this absolute foundational moment of human experience, the Annunciation. And he has it carved into the side of the wall, but carved in such a way that it's not just visual. It's carved in such a way that he can hear this image speak. Why don't you look at the other parts as well, my gentle master, Virgil said. And while I stood close by his side, the side that holds the heart. And so I turned my eyes and looked ahead past Mary's figure to that point where he who prompted me now stood. And there I saw another story cut into the stone. Crossing in front of Virgil, I drew near so that my eyes could take in all of it. Carved in the spread of marble there, I saw the cart and oxen with the holy ark, a warning not to exceed one's competence. Ahead of it moved 7 separate choirs, testing my senses. One of these said no, the other said yes, they truly sing. With equal art, the smoke which censers poured was traced so faithfully that eyes and nose could not decide between a yes or no. Ahead, far beyond the sacred ark, his robes girt up, the humble psalmist danced, showing himself both more and less than king. Depicted on the other side was Michal. As from a palace window she looked on, her face revealed her sadness and her scorn. I moved away from that place to observe at closer range another story told in whiteness, just beyond the face of Michal. So the second image that he has is King David bringing the ark into Jerusalem, and that fantastic triumphant parade that's recounted, and his wife's scorn at seeing him dancing, that moment that makes him both more and less than king. The unity of the Old Testament brought into the New, the unity of a king that plays the fool in the street, and by playing the fool becomes more than just a king. But then Dante goes even further, and he brings in something from classical history. Here was retold the magnanimity of that great prince of Rome, whose excellence moved Gregory to win his greatest fight. There rode the noble Trajan emperor, and clinging to his bridle as she wept, a wretched widow, carved in lines of grief. The trampled space surrounding him was packed with knights on horseback, eagles flying high, threaded in gold of banners in the wind. That poor widow amid the massive shapes seemed to be saying, Lord, avenge my son who has been killed. My heart is cut with grief. He seemed to answer, you will have to wait for my return. And she, like one impelled by frantic grief, but oh my Lord, if you should not return. And he, who takes my place will do it for me. She, how can you let another's virtue take the place of yours? Then he, take comfort, for I see I must perform my duty now before I leave. Justice so wills, and pity holds me here. That one for whom no new thing can exist, fashioned this art of visible speech, so strange to us who do not know it here on earth. The story that Dante recounts in the third example here is that comes down to him through a tradition about Gregory the Great. The story goes that Gregory was reading this story in a life of Trajan about the year 600. And Trajan is off to go conquer Dacia, modern-day Romania. And he's encountered by this widow who asks for justice. Her son has been killed, and she waits for the vengeance there, the proper vengeance on those who have killed her son. And Trajan wants to put her off, but she appeals to what his real nature as king is. And it's not necessarily to go and conquer lands, but the role, and Dante is insistent on this throughout the Divine Comedy, that God's purpose is not just to bring man back to him through salvation. On earth, God wills for human society to be just. And Dante has a particular hatred in his heart for those kings who do not provide justice to their people. The story goes that as Gregory the Great is reading this, he is so moved by the example of Trajan's dedication to justice that he prays to God for a miracle that Trajan can be saved. And as the story is told, God is so moved by Gregory's prayers that God brings Trajan back from the dead, allows him to live just long enough to receive baptism so that he can then be baptized and die as a Christian and be worthy of salvation. Whatever we think about this story about Gregory the Great, it holds such a central truth about how Dante and how we as Christians are called to see all of history, that everything that occurs plays a part in God's willing salvation for his people. And then Dante casts this in beautiful poetry, but poetry that then describes what is technically known in Greek as ekphrasis, where we try to describe a visual image through poetry. So Dante is leaning on his own powers as a poet to try to describe this visible art. Dante is summoning up all of his individual powers to try to put his own imagination to project forth an image of truth for subsequent readers. And it's an image that is all embracing of the human experience. He continues on past the images that are in the side of the wall. And we're going to skip over. I want to look just at the end of this section in Purgatory. But he then meets the souls of the proud who are forced to carry heavy blocks upon their back. Those who were stiff-necked in life are now having their necks literally pushed to the ground. Humility in its Latin root means to become close to the ground itself, humus. And so Dante depicts them as something that was very common in the medieval world. Corbels could be seen in buildings where you had to have an architectural support for the roof. And the corbels that held the weight of the roof would quite often have these little images of men carved into them as though these images were actually supporting the weight. So Dante takes what had been an architectural detail in his day and turns it into an image of sort of the gift of pride in purgatory, that it allows us, for us to be cleared of this issue of pride in the next world. We are bent down like these figures on earth who only appeared to be carrying weights, but the weights that the proud carry are much heavier. As Dante goes through purgatory, this is the way that he proceeds. He brings up examples of the virtue that is opposed to the sin that is being corrected on each level. And he finds examples not just in the Bible, not just in Christian history, but he always unites it with an example from what would have been considered secular history. And he does this to show that all history is united towards this one point. So after he goes through the terrace, on his way out, he sees more images this time of the vice itself. Instead of these images being cast up on the wall, because to look at the images on the wall, you simply have to turn your head. After you've been through the act of purgation on this terrace of pride, you should be looking down at the ground. And so here, the examples of pride that are carved into the rock itself, so that you see them with the bent head. And again, Dante mixes examples from all of human experience. I saw on one side him who was supposed to be the noblest creature of creation plunge swift as lightning from the height of heaven. I saw Briareus on the other side, pierced through by the celestial thunderbolt. heavy upon the ground, frozen in death. I saw Thymbraeus, saw Pallas and Mars still armed, close to their father, looking down at severed, scattered members of the giants. I saw the mighty Nimrod by his tower, standing there stunned and gazing at the men who shared at Shinar his bold fantasy. O Niobe, I saw your grieving eyes that wept your carved image on the road, between your 7 and 7 children slain. O Saul, transfixed by your own sword, how dead you seem to lie on Mount Gilboa's plain, which since that time has known no rain or dew. O mad Arachne, I could see you there, half turned to spider, sad above the shreds of your own work that sentenced you. O Rehoboam, the image of you here no longer threatens. In a chariot it flees fear-stricken, though no man pursues. Depicted too in that hard pavement was Alcmaeon, who made his mother pay so dearly for the accursed ornament. Depicted were Sennacherib's own sons, assaulting him at prayer within his temple, and their departure as he lay there dead. Depicted was Tomyris with the ruin and slaughter that she wrought, for her words to Cyrus, blood you have thirsted for, now drink your own. Depicted was the rout of the Assyrians who fled at Holofernes' death. It showed the remnants of his mutilated corpse. I saw Troy gaping from its ashes there. O Ilium, how you were fallen low, depicted on the sculptured road of stone. So Dante once again practices this art of ekphrasis, where he uses his poetry to describe something visible. And he alternates, for the most part here, images from Christian tradition, images from classical tradition. Lucifer, the most brilliant of angels, who through pride is plunged down to the pit of hell. Briareus, who in Greek mythology is one of the giants who leads a rebellion against Zeus and is struck down with a thunderbolt. Thymbraeus, again, with the giants in their death from the same example, and then compared to Nimrod. Nimrod, the king who is responsible for the Tower of Babel. And towards the end of Inferno, when we got into the very lowest pit, the level of treason, which is very closely associated in Dante's mind with pride, we had all these images of giants striving against the gods and man building up towers. The tower for Dante is the perfect example of man's pride, exactly as it appears in Genesis. The Tower of Babel is built specifically as, let us build a tower up to the heavens and that other people may remember our name. And then these examples taken again, alternating between Niobe, who had 14 beautiful children, compared them to the beauty of the gods, and of course had her children executed for her own presumption, compared then to Saul, Arachne, Rehoboam. And what Dante does in all of this, highlighted, we have the first word of all of these tercets of his poetry. In the Italian, he uses these to spell out uomo, the Italian word for man. So he writes an acrostic into his poetry that man's nature, when corrupted the worst, is the image itself of pride. Again, the unity of the entire experience is brought together here. All of the examples that Dante knew through classical history, classical mythology, biblical stories, all of it coming together here in his example of what is wrong with human society when it's led by those who take pride in themselves rather than humbling themselves before God. And this final line, what master artist with his brush or pen could reproduce shapes and shadings here? Such art must overwhelm the subtlest mind. And that's Dante's goal throughout all of the Divine Comedy with this art, is to provide something in poetry that overwhelms the subtlest mind and puts it in the only direction that is available once you have exhausted art. And that is art that leads you to a meditation on God. And I'm not going to go through all 7 of the steps of purgatory here, but I wanted to look at the next one, envy, just to see again the way that everything here is unified for Dante. The civil world, justice on earth, understanding our role as creatures of God, loving our neighbors as ourselves. All of this for Dante is the same argument with the same solution. So after Dante and Virgil climb up the stairway that'll take them up to this second terrace. They're now on the terrace of envy. Now we are standing at the highest step where for a second time we saw a ledge cut in the mountain that heals all those who climb. Another definition that Dante gives us of purgatory, that even though we suffer in purgatory, it is the suffering that heals us through our climbing. Dante and Virgil are waiting to figure out exactly where they need to go, and as they wait, more exempla come to Dante. And as always, the exempla at the beginning of each terrace illustrate the virtue that should be put into action. And we have again virtues that are drawn from all of human experience. We had already gone along that ledge as far as what is called a mile on earth, and quickly too because of our own goodwill, when spirits who could not be seen were heard, as they came flying toward us, speaking words of courteous invitation to love's board. The first voice that came flying past us sang out loud and clear the words, "Vinum non habent." They have no wine. Then we could hear them echoing behind. Before the notes had faded quietly into distance, another voice cried out, "I am Orestes." And that voice too swept by. I said, "Father, what voices are these?" And just as I asked this, a third said, passing by, "Love those who do you harm." So whereas the examples for pride, took the entire canto, and we have to appreciate the idea that as Dante is trying to tell us about pride, he's obviously taking immense pride in his own poetic art there, spending an entire canto describing what God's images would look like. Here he goes through the exempla counter to envy in just 9 lines. As always for Dante, the first exempla that we have of virtue are drawn from Mary. So Mary saying to her son at the wedding at Cana, they have no wine. Then this is paired with a reference that comes out of the Greek tradition, I am Orestes. Orestes is a figure in Greek mythology who's known as a righteous murderer. He kills his mother and his mother's lover after his mother betrayed his father. And they come for him as a murderer to arrest him and put him to death. But the magistrates don't know exactly who Orestes is. So if we remember that scene in Spartacus where they're trying to arrest Spartacus in the end, and everyone stands up saying, "I am Spartacus," to save the real Spartacus, it's drawn from this example in Greek history, where Orestes' friend stands up and says, "I am Orestes." An example that comes out of the classical world that perfectly illustrates that line of, well, what is the greatest love? To lay down one's life for a friend. We have that out of the Greek tradition. And Dante's showing the divine truth that speaks to. Even if, and this is always the case for Dante, the classical tradition speaks unknowingly of the truth that it points to, it still points in its way towards truth. And it's unifying all of this to understand the human experience. And then Dante and Virgil, as they always do, go forth. They hear the souls singing their songs. They hear the souls in prayer. The one last grouping out of purgatory that I wanted to look at is from Terrace 3, that on wrath, because this is where Dante most explicitly brings up the question of imagination, and we get to see imagination in this full sense, that sense that Aquinas talked about, where imagination is not just a plaything to come up with things that aren't real to keep ourselves entertained. Imagination is a way of approaching, of unifying the spiritual and the material and understanding and finding solutions to the problems that we have. So as Dante goes up onto this next ledge, reader, if you've ever found yourself caught in a mountain fog, trying to see your way through, as sightless as a mole, Remember how at last that damp, dense air starts to dissolve, and how the sun's pale disk feebly begins to penetrate the mist. And you will find it easy to recall what it was like when I finally saw the sun again, the sun about to set. Marching the faithful footsteps of my guide, I walked out of that cloud into the light, whose rays had died out on the shore below. O power of fantasy that steals our minds from things outside to leave us unaware, although 1,000 trumpets may blow loud. What stirs you if the senses show you nothing? Light stirs you, formed in heaven by itself, or by his will who sends it down to us. So Dante and Virgil here are walking off of that third terrace, and that third terrace was the terrace of wrath. And appropriately enough, the wrathful were surrounded by a thick cloud of, Dante describes it as a physical cloud that you could feel the darkness upon you. The way that the wrath blinds us, they were literally blind. And as they walk out of this, the examples that Dante sees come to him in the form of an ecstatic vision. And Dante asks about this. How does the ecstatic experience work? The ecstatic vision where from the Greek, it means to literally draw out of the body. The idea of the ecstatic vision is that you see things that are true, but not with your usual corporeal vision. So Dante asks this question, power of fantasy. And fantasy here is not in the modern sense of something that's appropriate to kids reading about Harry Potter. Fantasy is part of this faculty psychology that allows us to take our understanding of the world and consider it in our own mind. The fantasy takes these images, these sounds, everything that our senses bring to us, and the fantasy projects those on the internal screen of our mind and can manipulate them. And what Dante's saying here is sometimes the fantasy is able to focus so much on what it presents that we ignore material reality around us. And all of us have had that experience, of course, where you are so captivated by a thought or an idea that you literally lose track of time, and your brain simply ceases to process sound. I usually get this when my wife has been yelling at me for 30 seconds or so to pay attention because I had drifted off somewhere and simply didn't hear her calling for me. Dante here experiences this as he's walking through this thick cloud, the smoke of wrath. What stirs you if the senses show you nothing? And that is, if our brains work by dealing with images that we take from the outside world. The senses give us data about the world and we process that. How can an ecstatic vision happen when the senses aren't providing us anything? And Dante answers that light stirs in you, formed in heaven by itself, or by his will who sends it down to you. That God is the one who presents us these images, that God works directly upon us, directly upon what Dante would describe as the intellectual soul, the intellectual capacities of our soul. And it's in this place then where in my imagination, there took shape the impious deed committed by that being transformed into the bird that lives to sing. So in his storehouse of memories, in his storehouse of images, the way that Aquinas refers to it. So imagination here, not as playtime for a child, but imagination as the proper part of the mind for the serious adult intellectual to solve problems, to understand reality in a way that transcends material reality itself. And so first he sees the impious deed committed by that being transformed into a bird that lives to sing, the horrible story of Procne from Greek mythology that involves rape and murder and the transformation of sisters into the swallow and the nightingale. My mind became, at this point, so withdrawn into itself that reality of things outside could not have entered there. Then poured into my soaring fantasy a figure crucified, whose face revealed contempt and fury even as he died. By him stood the great Ahasuerus, Esther his wife, and the just Mordecai. Integrity in word and deed was his. And so here we're going from the book of Esther and the story of Haman. Then, when this image of its own accord burst like a bubble, when the watery film around it breaks, another vision rose in my imagination, a young girl bitterly weeping, saying, "Oh, my queen, why did you let your rage destroy your life? You killed yourself rather than lose Lavinia. Now you have lost me. I am she who mourns your death, mother, before another's." This last image that Dante brings up is from the Aeneid. The Aeneid is the great patriotic poem of Rome. It's the great poem of the poet Virgil. So as Dante and Virgil are walking through the Terrace of Pride, Dante has an ecstatic image that comes from Virgil's own poem. It involves a suicide in the poem, and what's going on in the Aeneid isn't particularly important. The role that Dante gives the Aeneid is incredibly important. It's a great example of wrath, that this woman is so infuriated that she kills herself and destroys her family. But it's an example of wrath that comes from a poet and a poem that Dante gives special significance to. And the special significance of Virgil, the Aeneid, and all of Roman history for Dante comes to fruition in Purgatorio 22. In this, Dante and Virgil have an unexpected visitor. The Roman poet Statius, who, the historical poet, was a pagan. In Dante's fiction of the Divine Comedy, he actually tells us that he's turned into a Christian and has just now felt himself worthy of ascending into heaven. One of the delightful bits of the Divine Comedy is that the souls in the Divine Comedy are fully well aware of where they stand in the afterlife. The souls that are doomed to hell go there themselves, that they feel this inner compulsion towards the punishment that they have merited. The souls on purgatory aren't sitting there with, an accountant's ledger and a stopwatch trying to figure out when they're eligible to go to heaven. The souls in purgatory have an innate ability to recognize when they are purified. And when they feel purified, that is the moment that they ascend up into heaven. Or they ascend up to the next level and work their way up towards heaven. And this is what's happening here in this poem. And Dante presents something that's just absolutely remarkable, is that he's going to have this poet Statius, that he's turned into a Christian, become a Christian precisely because of Statius's love of the Roman poet Virgil. So Virgil, Dante's character, is naturally interested in knowing why it is that Statius gets to be in purgatory when Virgil and all of his friends are in hell. It's an incredibly bittersweet moment. Statius's explanation of how this happens is fantastic. It's poetically beautiful, and in terms of allegorical readings, it can direct so much in our own lives, but it's also fantastic for illustrating how Dante sees the unity of thought, the unity of knowledge, the unity of all human experience. So Statius says, answering this question to Virgil, "How am I saved? It was you directed me to drink Parnassus's waters. It was you whose radiance revealed the way to God. You were the lonely traveler in the dark who holds his lamp behind him, shedding light not for himself, but to make others wise. For you once wrote, 'The world is born again. Justice returns in the first age of man, and a new progeny descends from heaven. Through you, I was a poet, through you, a Christian. And now to show you better what I mean, I shall fill in my outline with more color.'" And Statius then goes on and gives them this sort of alternate biography that Dante has created for him. What's far more interesting to us, though, are these words of Virgil's that Statius has quoted. "The world is born again, justice returns, the first age of man, and a new progeny." These are words that come out of one of Virgil's poems. It's known as the Fourth Eclogue. The Fourth Eclogue is one of those things that defies rational analysis, we'll say. The secular humanist idea in understanding Dante and Virgil is to say that Dante saw Virgil as a sort of proto-Christian because that's how he wanted to interpret everything. However, this view ignores the fact that Dante had very good reasons for viewing Virgil this way. Dante has very good reasons for viewing Roman history as a preparation for Christ the way that he does. So Virgil's fourth eclogue. The eclogues are a collection of poetry based on sort of the bucolic genre, where a bunch of shepherds sit around singing poems about how wonderful the shepherd's life is, the pastoral poem. It's interesting throughout the history of literature that poets that live in the greatest city of the day are always very fast to praise the shepherd's life as ideal. The one poet that we know of in history that actually was a shepherd is Hesiod, and Hesiod absolutely despised the life. But for Virgil living in Rome, he could praise the life of the shepherd as being wonderful and simple because he didn't actually live it. In the fourth eclogue, Virgil breaks off entirely from these poems that are about the shepherds' lives, and he goes into a moment of prophecy. And we'll read it aloud here, parts of it, because it's something that demands serious interpretation about, is Dante right? So, Muses of Sicily, sing we a somewhat ampler strain, not all men's delight is in coppices and lowly tamarisks. If we sing of the woods, let them be woods worthy of a consul. Now is come the last age of the Cumaean prophecy. The great cycle of periods is born anew. Now returns the maid, returns the reign of Saturn. Now from high heaven a new generation comes down. Yet do thou at that boy's birth, in whom the iron race shall begin to cease, and the golden to arise all over the world. Holy Lucina, be gracious. Now thine own Apollo reigns, and in thy consulates, and in thine, O Pollio, shall this glorious age enter, and the great months begin their march. Under thy rule, what traces of our guilt yet remain, vanishing shall free earth forever from alarm. He shall grow in the life of gods, and shall see gods and heroes mingled, and himself be seen by them, and shall rule the world that his father's virtues have set at peace. Virgil writes a poem somewhere around 40 BC that explicitly predicts the birth of a child who is going to set the world at peace. Now returns the maid, that is Virgo, the constellation. We have a virgin birth, the reign of Saturn. In Greco-Roman mythology, the reign of Saturn was considered to be a golden age when life was perfect, when mankind was at peace, when man didn't have to struggle. If you read the descriptions of the golden age that appear in Greek and Roman poetry, the comparisons to what Eden should have been are unavoidable. And Dante makes those comparisons throughout. So Virgil is imagining that we are now at a pivotal moment in history when a divine child is going to be born and put an end to this iron age of blood and strife, initiate a golden age. And skipping ahead, so I won't read the entire thing since it's in this style that just doesn't work well in English. Draw nigh to thy honors. Even now will the time become, O dear offsprings of God, mighty germ of Jove. Behold the world swaying her orbed mass, lands and spaces of sea and depth of sky. Behold how all things rejoice in the age to come. So Virgil is a poet that's so totally different from other Roman poets in his religious sensibility. It's a religious sensibility that is not easy to characterize. It's believed by most scholars that as Virgil is searching for some sense of religious truth, that he came across the prophet Isaiah and read at least parts of Isaiah. And he recognizes in Isaiah that speaks something to his own soul. And in this poem here, he predicts the coming of this golden age at the hand of this divine child. This isn't to say, I'm not suggesting that Virgil is a secret Christian writing in code about the coming of Christ, but the idea of the prophet who speaks truth without fully understanding that truth. That's not so much my interpretation of Virgil as simply the literal reading of what Virgil writes. When Virgil writes the Aeneid, he's writing, for the first time in history, a hero who has a divine mission that he is supposed to fulfill on earth. Aeneas has a role that he rejects, that he wants to reject, that is to found this new city that will become Rome because it's part of the gods' eternal plan. Before Virgil, there is nothing in literature like this, that the gods have intentions for the earth, that the gods have a plan for human history that reaches a specific point that will create a better society, and that there are individual human beings who have their life task to make this happen. That's an idea that exists nowhere else. And so it's this poet that then sings of this coming great age. Again, like the idea of Virgil as a, however we want to understand how he writes these things, you know, that question's up to whoever wants to read Virgil. But if we simply read the letter of what he's put on his page, he is predicting a religious revival that occurs 40 years before the birth of the Son of God and the greatest transformation of human society in all of history. And then the role of Rome in history, I'm including this now, I did not include these slides. Dante sees the Roman Empire as playing a pivotal role, and he sees it as playing the role of making sure that at the birth of Christ, the world was at peace. It's an old argument, and this one goes back, I mean, it's certainly not mine, it's not Dante's, it goes back to at least the 3rd century. What the early fathers saw is that Christ was born during the period that's known as the Pax Romana, or the Pax Augustana, the peace of Rome, Augustus's peace. When Octavian Caesar, who becomes Augustus, the first emperor, when he defeats Mark Antony in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium, he ends 100 years of civil war that had torn Rome apart. From the Gracchi attempted revolution in Rome in the 130s, where they were going to give land back to the poor. They were going to have sort of, I guess it would be the Bernie Sanders revolution of the late Roman Republic. From that period until 31, Rome basically did not know peace. Caesar and Pompey was just another round of these civil wars that were nonstop. And the very simple historical fact is, Roman history up until 31 BC is incredibly bloody. One of the books that I use for teaching history at Holy Family High School is simply named Atrocities, the subtitle being the 100 Deadliest Events in Human History. And this book goes through and it catalogs the 100 deadliest multicides, is what the author refers to them as. Combinations of war, man-made famine, disease that was allowed to go unchecked. All of these great episodes in which there was massive, massive human death. Of these 100 events, 7 of them occur from the period of 300 BC to 31 BC, just in Roman history. 2 of the Punic Wars appear. Of the civil wars, you have the slave revolt, you have the war, what's known as the War of the Allies, the Sochi War in 90 BC. It's just nonstop bloodfest, essentially, that runs from 300 BC until 30 years before Christ is born. When Augustus becomes emperor, he truly brings in an age of peace that the Mediterranean had not known in centuries, and that Europe would not know again. Christ is born into the world at a period of peace in European history that was unknown before and basically unknown after. We've had a period of peace in European history that has existed since World War II, that can only be compared to this Roman peace that lasted from 31 BC until about AD 180. This 200 years of unknown peace in European history is when Christ is born. So Dante's point about the Roman Empire having a function in this, it's not just Christian fantasy, it's borne out by the very basic facts of Roman life, Roman government, and more importantly, Roman death. With that happy point being made, I want to look at the end of Paradiso. Everything that we talked about in Purgatory was to show for Dante the essential unity of knowledge and human experience. And then in Paradiso, he's going to take this beyond the unity of human experience in terms of secular and religious life into the unity of material and spiritual reality. That unity that sadly so many people discount, but that unity that is so essential for us to be able to articulate if we are in any way to explain or defend our faith. So in Paradiso, Dante has abandoned Virgil because Virgil is not worthy to show him paradise. Dante is now being guided by Beatrice, who was an earthly woman that Dante loved in the troubadour sense of loving a woman from afar. A love that is not consummated physically, a love that is this medieval ennobling love that encourages you so that you might be worthy of this one person to make yourself a better human being, to make yourself somebody who is worth being loved by her. That's the role that Beatrice served in Dante's youth when he was a lyric love poet. And she's the figure that Dante resurrects in the Divine Comedy to be literally the guide who will take him to God. The idea of what perfect earthly love is supposed to be, a love that brings you to God, a love that does not make itself the end, but makes itself a passageway, a mediator to God. And that's what Beatrice becomes. So they ascend through the celestial spheres, the planets, the stars, and in Paradiso 27, they get to the end of the physical universe, what they call the prima mobile, the end of physical reality as we know it, the last sphere. It's something that comes out of Greek astrology, Greek astronomy, but works just as well in the cosmos that Dante has. So what's going to happen then is that Dante he literally steps out of material reality, and what is left at that point? He crosses a border that is almost impossible to describe. He's moving in his body and he's continuing to ascend, but he ascends into something where there is no more up. So what does he cross? And he crosses something that modern physicists have recognized as a three-sphere. It's a theoretical four-dimensional object. The best description I've heard of it is, if you can imagine a point being extended into a line, that extension occurs by taking the edges of the point somehow and drawing them out. Then if you take a line and you add another dimension to make it a two-dimensional circle, you take that line that's been drawn out and you rotate it again along those edges. Now you have a circle in 2 dimensions. To turn that into a 3-dimensional object, you take that whole circle and you rotate it along another axis. And by rotating what had been its edge, you now have the surface of a sphere. If you can imagine then taking the surface of that 3-dimensional sphere and rotating it in a 4th dimension, so that what had been the container is now something like a diameter. Now you're entering into a 4-dimensional area, and that's exactly what Dante does here in Paradiso. And it's this way that he links for us the physical reality of the heavens and the spiritual reality of the angelic choirs that they host. So he's made this crossover into this new spiritual reality that he can see somehow. We're not exactly sure how, but he describes it this way. I saw a point at the very center of everything. I saw a point that radiated light so piercing that the eyes its brightness strikes are forced to shut from such intensity. That star which seems the smallest, seen from here, if set beside that point like star by star appearing in the heavens, would seem a moon. Perhaps the distance of a halo's glow around the brilliant source that colors it when vapors hold it in their density. As close as that, a ring of fire whirled around this point at speed that would surpass the sphere that spins the swiftest round the world. This one was circled by a second, second by a third, third by yet a fourth, fifth the fourth, and then the sixth the fifth. The seventh followed, spreading out so wide that Juno's messenger, if made complete, could not contain it in her circle bow. So came the eighth, the ninth, and each of them revolved more slowly, according as it was in number farther from the central one, whose radiance was clearest of them all. For circling nearest the pure spark of being, I think it shares fullest in its truth. My lady, who observed my eagerness and bewilderment, said, on that point depend all nature and all of the heavens. Observe the circle nearest it, and know the reason for its spinning at such speed is that love's fire burns it into motion. So, to try to make sense of this, the last thing that Dante has seen here on the left is the material universe. Everything spins around the earth. You have the stars that spin in this outer circle. The sun is inside of that. All the planets are inside of that. And the speed with which they spin increases the further that you go out. So the stars are whirling around because they have to make this, I want to say in Dante's understanding, about a 1 billion-mile journey they have to complete in 24 hours. The moon and the stars and everything else that spins on orbits inside of that can move slower. Dante's crossed over that, and he sees something like this, a single point of absolute brilliant light, and around that he sees circles. The best that I can come up with for what Dante sees would be something like this. And what he's seeing here are the choirs of angels. And what's interesting is I cannot literally I cannot visually represent what Dante has described. And nobody can using digital technology. What he describes is at the very center is God. And God is this infinitesimally small point. And it's a point of absolute brilliant light. The way that computers work, of course, is that the way that the monitor works is that it can show light or not show light. But the individual pixel that shows light doesn't go up or down in brightness. It's either on or it's off. So if I try to make this single point smaller than it is, it's going to appear less bright because of the limitations of digital technology. If I made it an actual infinitesimally small point, we couldn't see it at all. For Dante, however, this infinitesimally small point is absolutely brilliant. So you see this light that with the best of, well, not the best of, but decent 21st century technology. I had to teach myself 3D animation for this. But even with that, I literally cannot show what Dante describes. That at this point in time, his poetry has gone beyond what modern technology can actually show. And of course, then Dante goes through and he explains that what you're seeing are the choirs of angels in the particular order, and his point on the order is fantastic. The seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, angels. For Dante, it's not as though he's gone into some separate reality. He's gone into a place where he can now see the spiritual reality that is part of the physical reality that he sees that's manifested in the stars and the planets. Dante's belief, and the common medieval belief, is that all of the stars are moved by angelic love. Each one of these choirs is associated with one of the celestial spheres. And the reason, and this is just one of the most beautiful thoughts out of the medieval world, the reason why the stars move at night, the reason why the planets circle around is out of love. And they move with a speed that is consistent with how great their love is. Dante has a problem with this because he notices that in the spiritual universe, whatever is closest to the center moves the fastest, but in the physical world, whatever is furthest from the center moves the fastest. And Beatrice explains how this happens because he's measuring by the wrong key. He's measuring by a sense of geographical size. But when we make this change from the material world to the spiritual world, the one thing that allows us to compare the two, the one thing that links them, is love. And the love of the angels that are closest to God, that share most in the vision of God, are the seraphim. And because they love greater, they spin faster. All love, but the nature of their love, their ability to love, is determined by their nearness to God, and that is what allows them to spin faster than they do. And so if we go back to what I described about the three sphere, that theoretical object of four-dimensional space in physics, if we try to think about how we went from a circle to a sphere by doing that spin, where you take the circle and you rotate it about an axis, now you have a complete sphere. If you were to go along the edge of the sphere, you would start off with, and you can see this on a globe if you look at the lines of latitude. Closest to the pole, those lines are the smallest. As you go towards the equator, the lines get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then once you cross the equator, once you cross that diameter that we used to spin and make the sphere in the first place, then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's because as we're moving across this sphere, we're judging by size. If we take that idea and apply it then to what Dante is describing about the union of the material and the spiritual worlds, and we think in terms of love, Dante's universe is geocentric. And one of the worst ideas that's often told in the history of science is that medieval man had the geocentric universe because it made man important by putting him at the center of the universe. It's absolutely not true. The fact that he was at the center of the universe was the sign that he was corrupted, because that put him farther away from God. In Dante's universe, the very center of the universe is Satan, where Satan is completely bereft of love and so sits there. If we take this idea of measuring according to love from the center of the universe all the way out towards God, the little comparison works that the further that you go out from Satan to the universe, to the sphere of the moon, which is associated with the archangels, then to Mercury and Venus, and we move in a direct line, then when we cross over this edge of the material universe and we cross into seeing just spiritual reality, as we continue moving with increased love, then we come towards the center point of this, which is absolute love in God itself. So Dante has created for us an image of this four-dimensional universe where the fourth dimension isn't time, it's love itself. And it works this way because as Dante imagines time, time is a measurement in the difference of objects as they move. But movement for Dante is based entirely upon desire, and desire is based upon love. All motion, all movement that occurs in Dante's universe occurs because of love, not necessarily a good love. The souls that are in hell end up there because they were moved by bad loves. But it's love that causes us to move. It's love that causes the angels to spin their heavens. And so it's love that ultimately is this fourth dimension by which we move through the distinction between material and spiritual realities. And in this one just absolutely phenomenal canto, we have this explanation of how all of cosmos, all of creation, material and spiritual at the same time, work according to this principle. Beatrice's explanation for Dante about why the two don't seem to jive to him. If you wish to be satisfied, listen to what I tell you, then sharpen your wits on it. The course of the material spheres is wide or narrow in accord with more or less of virtue that infuses each throughout. In Dante's universe, virtue is reflected in physical size. The fact that the heaven of the stars is the largest indicates that it's also more virtuous than the smaller ones. The greater goodness makes for greater bliss. A greater bliss calls for a greater body in the material universe, if it is perfect in all of its parts. Therefore, this sphere, which sweeps all of the world along with it, that prima mobile that gives motion to the entire universe, must correspond to this, the inner ring that loves and knows the most. So what had been physically, geographically the largest is the smallest ring here, because it's the ring according to love in this scale is closest to God. The proper way of measuring it is according to love, and then you can see how this sort of inversion occurs. If you will take your measurement not by circumference, but by the power inherent in these beings that look like rings, you will observe a marvelous congruence of greater power to more, lesser to small, in every heaven with its intelligence. And so while it might seem like an exercise in sort of abstract medieval cosmology that's been proven false, the central notion of this, that the way that we judge all of creation, if we view it in its unity as both spiritual and material reality, being creatures of God, we learn to measure that appropriately by love. Love is the only way that allows us to make an appropriate jump from the material into the spiritual world. It is love alone. And then the description continues, and Beatrice goes through exactly how they're ordered. And we notice what's kind of interesting about this is if you go into angelology, the 9 angels are ordered differently in their hierarchy by Gregory the Great and by Pseudo-Dionysius. Pseudo-Dionysius is probably a 4th century Neoplatonic who wrote the Celestial Hierarchies and On the Divine Names. Gregory the Great later on, when reflecting on angels, also put them into hierarchies. And in this one moment, Dante has these lines that are just so charming that Dionysius set his mind to contemplate these ranks with so much holy zeal for truth, he named them and ordered them the way I do. Gregory later disagreed with him, but when he died to waken in this heaven, he saw the truth and laughed at his mistake. And that such secrets were revealed by one still living, you need not wonder. The one who saw it here told the truth and many other truths about these rings. So we have Beatrice telling Dante, the character, that Gregory was wrong about the way he ordered them, which sort of indicates that Dante, the writer of this poem, is correcting Gregory the Great in this sort of charming roundabout way. The point of this, though, is that in the Middle Ages, it was believed that Dionysius, who wrote the Celestial Hierarchies, was Dionysius the Areopagite, who was the who was one of St. Paul's missionaries. So the belief was that Dionysius in the Celestial Hierarchies received his information from St. Paul, who had actually seen the order of the heavens when he was wrapped up into the heavens themselves. As he tells us, you know, I know a man who was raptured up into the 3rd heaven. So that's Dante's little explanation for why Dionysius was right and Gregory was wrong, but there's just this little charming bit where Dante corrects Gregory and considers himself to be correct. And I will end here today appropriately with Dante's ultimate act of imagination, and imagination in that broadest Aquinas sense of using our mind to take what we have through the senses and to create understandings. And this is at the end of the poem, where Dante has the vision of God and tries to report that vision back to man. And as beautiful as this canto is, I won't read the whole thing, but we will go through as Dante tries to describe what he sees in his final account. He tries a couple of times in this canto, after this beautiful prayer to the Virgin that begins this, which I've talked about wasting too much time. I'll go ahead and just read it at this point anyway, I suppose. O Virgin Mother, daughter of your Son, most humble, most exalted of all creatures, chosen of God in his eternal plan, you are the one who ennobled human nature to the extent that he did not disdain, who was its maker, to make himself man. Within your womb rekindled was the love that gave the warmth that did allow this flower to come to bloom within this timeless peace. For all up here, you are the noonday torch of charity, down on earth for men, the living spring of their eternal hope. Lady, you are so great, so powerful, that who seeks grace without recourse to you would have his wish fly upward without wings. Not only does your loving kindness rush to those who ask for it, but oftentimes it flows spontaneously before the plea. In you is tenderness, in you is pity, in you munificence. In you unites all that is good in God's created beings. And Dante's point here is that he does not get the vision of God on his own. He is not worthy to demand that for himself. He humbly asks the Virgin's assistance, and the Virgin then accepts Dante's prayer, and the Virgin is the one who intercedes for this vision. Dante tries a couple of times to describe this over the course of 60 lines or so, but then finally in 109, we have his final attempt at describing the divine vision. Not that within the living light, there was more than a sole aspect of the divine, which always is what it always has been. Yet, as I learned to see more, the power of vision grew in me. That single aspect, as I changed, seemed to me to change itself. That single aspect, that single brilliant point of light he described before. Within its depthless clarity of substance, I saw the great light shine into three circles, in three clear colors bound in one same space. The first seemed to reflect the next like a rainbow on rainbow, and the third was a flame equally breathed forth by the other two. How weak my words fall short of conception, which is of itself so far from what I saw that weak is much too weak a word to use. So in this, we first have Dante's description of the Trinity. All throughout Paradiso, Dante is tied to two mysteries, that of the Trinity and the Incarnation. And so here we have to try to comprehend Dante's attempt at this, that you have three circles in three clear colors bound in one same space. And that in itself is impossible, seeing three distinct colors in one same space. But then the first reflects the second like a rainbow, and the third a flame equally breathed forth by the other two. As far as descriptions of the canonical description, that the love of the Father for the Son and of the Son for the Father is the creation of the Holy Spirit, you have about as good of a poetic description of that as you can get. Then he's going to move on, and he's going to come to the second of the mysteries that dominate Paradiso, and that is the Incarnation. O light, eternal, fixed in self alone, known only to yourself and knowing self, you love and glow, knowing and being known. That circling which, as I conceived it, shone in you as your own first reflected light, when I had looked deep into it a while, seemed in itself and in its own self-color to be depicted with man's very image. My eyes were totally absorbed in it. As the geometer who tries so hard to square the circle, but cannot discover, think as he may, the principle involved, so did I strive with this new mystery. I yearned to know how could our image fit into that circle, how it could conform. And the image here of the geometer squaring the circle. This is the great problem of classical geometry, is how can you make a square and a circle commensurate? How do you come up with the figuration of what we call pi, that irrational number? How can you describe it?
Almost over.
And so for Dante, that is the geometer who can't solve this problem. This is the way he sits, trying to understand what it is that he's seeing. He sees the incarnation, but he lacks the ability to comprehend it. My own wings could not take me so high. Then a great flash of understanding struck my mind, and suddenly its wish was granted. At this point, power failed high fantasy. But like a wheel in perfect balance turning, I felt my will and my desire impelled by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. So as Dante is sitting there trying to understand what he sees, of his own will, he can't do this. But he has a momentary flash of divine understanding, and that wish is granted. And when he says, my fantasy failed, what he's talking about is that imagination that we've been discussing. The best ability that man has to take the senses that he has, to recombine them, to find a way of understanding. That fails. But what he does have is his will and desire become one with the divine will and desire. The love that moves the sun and the other stars. That is the object loved by the angels that love the sun and stars, and that which causes its motion. His will and his desire is impelled by God. His will and his desire in this moment are perfectly aligned. And that is the best description that he can give, is to break away from this beautiful poetry that he's worked with, and to simply say that he himself has become like the bodies that are moved only by love of God. Okay, and right at the hour and a half, but mostly because I started my little timer late, I didn't want to go too far. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to your meeting. I greatly appreciate this opportunity. And of course, living not entirely in the spiritual, but in the material world itself, my employment at the biblical school is basically contingent upon making sure that my classes are well received and attended. If you liked what I presented today, let me encourage you to look into the Dante class that I offer through the biblical school. For full-time employees of the Archdiocese, which includes everybody by definition in a deacon's retreat, the tuition waiver is complete. So if you would like to attend the class, you can sign up for it, and there is no cost. But most importantly, if what I've had could be useful to the parishioners that you have, I would greatly appreciate any encouragement that you could give them for this course. All right, thank you very much, and I guess I will check out at that point.
Great, thank you, Dr. Fabian. Wish I had somebody like you to explain this to me when I was in high school reading this.
I don't want to be horribly arrogant, but I'm going to say that I am one of the very, very, very few high school teachers in this country that have the foundation in medieval theology, philosophy, and classical history to be able to explain it this way.
Well, thank you. Very well done. And
I want to make sure that I take my decade of study and put it in the use of the larger community. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We're very appreciative to have you with us this morning. Thank you.